you bring up the case of like a Shakespearean tragedy, or maybe even in the tradition of a Greek tragedy. Yeah. It is the greatest strength of a great leader that also proves to be his, to borrow the Greek analogy, Achilles' heel. And I do believe that pragmatic realpolitik commitment and vision that made him so successful as effectively the greatest diplomat we've known. Kissinger gets a lot of credit, but called Nixon a diplomat as the U.S. president, also, I think, caused him to fall short of some of the goals that certainly someone like me from the present would have wished for Richard Nixon to have achieved.
And so, he had, moving to domestic issues, over 60% approval rating. His his policies were popular. He had a killer political instinct, but then, something went wrong. And now part of this could have been, he was a bit isolated. He had personnel around him that were, narrow. They were flatterers. He probably wasn't getting the best counsel. There are even, I think, some character decisions where I don't think he made the right move. I think he probably could have saved things from going where they did. Talk more about kind of the administrative state and that idea that he didn't eat it, so it ate him. What do you mean there?
Yeah. So he had this vision of the new federalism, right? He was somebody who was trying to pivot away from the legacy of Woodrow Wilson, perpetuated by FDR, metastasizing federal government, and that under the leadership of LBJ. He says, no, this isn't the right way to go. But I think there's a valuable lesson in here, even for the present. All right, when you're going after the Leviathan, and that's what he was going after, the Leviathan, you can't go after it with half measures. And so Nixon went in to drain the swamp.
Yeah.
And in the end, the swamp drained him. That's exactly what happened. And so he went in to drain the swamp. He said, okay, I want to reorganize the federal government. He had this vision of, okay, there's too many cabinet level posts. I'm going to consolidate the cabinet to, I think, 8 different cabinet posts. That was his vision. The only thing he ended up accomplishing was the postmaster general no longer became a cabinet level position. Okay. Other than that, he didn't accomplish much else, but he talked a lot about it. What did this do? It put the administrative state, that machine, that fourth branch of government, on notice that this guy is actually our enemy number one. But he's not actually, he's brandishing the guns, but he's not actually doing much with them.
It's a dangerous.
He's a sitting duck. Yeah. Absolutely. So he turned himself into a target, but without actually going the distance to eviscerate the very managerial bureaucracy he supposedly wanted to dismantle. To the contrary, they rolled him a little bit. Nixon actually was the guy who brought us the EPA.
Yeah.
One of the many 3-letter agencies that behaves as a fundamentally lawless institution today. That's an institution that regularly passes laws. They call them rules, but they have the effect of law by fiat that never went through Congress. Thankfully, the modern Supreme Court now is shooting down many of those unconstitutional EPA regulations. We complain about it on the right. We forget who gave us the EPA. It was actually Richard Nixon, right? Same thing with respect to OSHA, right? I mean, these are another 3 to 4-letter agencies, the alphabet soup of the federal government. Started with Woodrow Wilson, and, I lay a lot of blame at the feet of FDR and LBJ. But we wouldn't be intellectually honest with ourselves if we didn't acknowledge the role that Richard Nixon actually played in allowing that to continue to metastasize. He actually also, very little known fact, it gets a little technical, but it's important, signed into law what is known as effectively the impoundment prevention procedures. So impoundment prevention, Nixon signed this into law. This is important to me because on the day I ran for U.S. president, the day I declared my candidacy, there was a long list of policy commitments I made. One of them is that I would love to rescind this statute that was passed during Richard Nixon's era. Donald Trump has later come around and said that he would, correctly, I think, would want to rescind the same thing. What it basically says is if Congress authorizes certain funds to be spent by the executive must spend it. So it referred to the executive's lack of spending that money as impoundment. Right? So if it's been budgeted by Congress but isn't spent, it's impoundment. This is an anti-impoundment act or an impoundment prevention act that Nixon signed into law. That actually empowers the administrative state, empowers the deep state nexus between the professional politician class in Congress and the administrative state to whom they delegate their dirty work. If a chief executive can say, no, we don't need that money, just like a CEO could say, you've budgeted it, the board, but I don't need to spend it. That's the way it works in the private sector. It's the way it's worked for most of our history. If that were the case, then I think we would actually constrain the scope of today's regulatory state. So when we look at Richard Nixon, he had the right vision, right? But the vision was too incremental in nature. He put the administrative state on notice that, hey, I'm going to do things a little differently than FDR and LBJ and Woodrow Wilson, but didn't actually have the spine or the personnel around him to go the distance. And what did they do? They rolled him. Yeah. Right? And this could get a little bit spicy on our takes of history, but not only do I think they rolled him and they used him, that I think is indisputable. From the EPA to OSHA to impoundment prevention laws being signed into law, I think they actually may have played a role in hanging him out to dry in the end, right? I don't think the history of Watergate is exactly what you're taught when you're in ninth grade. I mean, you get the basic facts, but there's probably a lot more to that story than we are likely to ever know. And I think it's a function of that ratio of talking about draining the swamp without actually doing it, which means the swamp eventually not only drained him, but hung him out to dry. And I think those are eerily relevant lessons for the present day.
And to wrap up with Richard Nixon, so as we look at taking on the administrative state today, the odds are probably even less in our favor now than they were then. You have not only the media, the academy,
depends on what kind of leader you have.
Every institution, in society against you. So do we have any lessons from Nixon for how we might actually not get rolled and get that done?
Yeah, I think it depends on the class of leader you have, right? Richard Nixon had a contrarian, scrappy nature to his rise and to his leadership. It's what made him strong, and it's what made him who he is. He was skeptical of the managerial class, almost paranoid. I think those are actually good qualities you're going to need to take this on. But he did surround himself with an echo chamber of people who told him what he wanted to hear at times rather than what he needed to hear. There's an old saying. It says, if you care about somebody, you tell them the truth. If you care about yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. Richard Nixon was surrounded by a lot of people who cared about themselves, and they told him what he wanted to hear. Even if you think about Watergate, and this is just to sort of at least broach some questions that I think are interesting, right? You look at the guy who supposedly led, Richard Nixon, for all we know, didn't know about the break into the DNC headquarters, but the guy who led it, he was an ex-FBI guy. And the leak, Deep Throat, et cetera, about the whole thing came from somebody who was then within the FBI. And you wonder, right? I mean, after a certain point, he says he's going after the deep state. He's going after the administrative state. Doesn't quite do it. In fact, they use him to expand much of the deep state. But if he's saying it enough and he's not actually doing it, it made him a bit of a sitting duck for exploitation. And so all I'm saying is those are some interesting dots that I don't think have historically been connected. And maybe we'll never have the answers. But I do think there's a lot more to that story than meets the eye. And I think the lesson for today is we can't just talk about gutting the bureaucracy or draining the swamp. You got to go in and do it. And if not, you're in some ways in the worst position of all, where, like Richard Nixon, you tell yourself that you're doing it, but actually in some ways you've put the enemy, that machine, on notice that you might pose some risk for the machine when the machine just crushes you like they have to the citizens of this country for a long time. So, is that a much bigger administrative state today than it was back then? Yes, it is. And it will continue to be the cancer that kills this country unless I think we have leaders with a spine, but also who are part of having a spine is being willing enough to be challenged. Your basic presupposition is challenged by people who actually care about your best interests and the country's best interests. And I think in some ways, Richard Nixon didn't quite have that around him. And those would be some relevant lessons, to say the least, for us to take away today.